I unplugged the TV myself. I remember that clearly, because I remember feeling stupid for even trying it. The old flat screen in the cabin's living room kept flickering with static, and I figured a loose cord was to blame. So I got up, walked over, and pulled the plug straight out of the wall. The screen didn't go dark. It stayed lit, grainy, showing a slightly warped picture of the living room. My living room. From an angle I wasn't standing at, and then the picture moved. Not the static. The picture. Like something behind me had shifted its weight. I want to back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I'd booked the cabin 2 weeks after my engagement ended. I told myself I needed silence, mountain air, a place with no one asking how I was doing. The listing looked perfect, modern, wood-paneled, tucked into a ridge outside Aspen, with no neighbors for miles. The host, a man named Grant, messaged only through the app. Polite, brief. He mentioned there was no cell service up there, only his private Wi-Fi. I didn't think twice about that. I wanted to disappear for a while. The first night was fine. Quiet, the way I wanted. It wasn't until the second night, standing in front of that dead but not dead television, that I understood I hadn't picked an empty cabin. I had picked a cabin that was never actually empty at all. At first, I told myself it was a glitch. Some smart TVs cache a frame even after you cut the power. I'd read that somewhere, or I made it up to feel better. Either way, I unplugged the router too, just to be safe, and went to bed telling myself the screen would be black by morning. It wasn't the screen that bothered me the next day. It was the thermostat. I'd set it to 68 before bed. I woke up and it read 61, the display glowing faintly blue, and when I checked the little history log on the panel, it showed the temperature had been adjusted 3 times overnight, 1:40 a.m., 2:15, 3:50. I hadn't touched it once. I told myself the system was probably automated. Some energy-saving feature the host forgot to mention. Then I found the vent. I was moving my suitcase into the closet when I noticed one of the wall vents near the floor wasn't flush with the others. It sat maybe half an inch proud, like it had been removed and never seated back properly. When I crouched to look closer, I saw it wasn't a vent at all. It was a plate, screwed from the inside, with a small dark circle at its center, about the size of a coin. A lens. I was almost sure it was a lens. I told myself I was imagining it. Anxiety does that. It takes an ordinary object and turns it into evidence. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I messaged Grant through the app. Hey, quick question. Is there a vent behind the closet that's not sealed right? Also thought the TV glitched last night, just flagging it. His reply came fast. Too fast for someone supposedly living off-grid himself. That's just an old sensor for the smart heating system. Nothing to worry about. Enjoy the peace up there. That's what everyone comes for. Everyone. Not most guests. Everyone. Like he was picturing all of them at once. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept listening to the floor. Not the walls, the floor. There was a sound underneath it, faint and rhythmic, like something being dragged a few feet and set down. I told myself it was pipes settling in the cold. Around 2 a.m., the sound stopped directly beneath my bedroom, and stayed stopped. For almost 20 minutes, I lay there, absolutely still, listening to nothing. The kind of nothing that feels like someone is holding their breath on purpose. I turned on my phone flashlight and checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. Nothing. Just me, and a house that suddenly felt too quiet for how big it was. I didn't call it fear yet. I called it bad instincts from a bad year. I told myself I'd survive one more night and leave in the morning. I didn't know yet that the house wasn't going to let that decision be mine. I woke up to darkness. Full darkness, the kind with no hum of a refrigerator, no glow from a charging cable. The power was out. I grabbed my phone. No signal, obviously, but the screen still lit the room enough for me to see the bedroom door. I reached it and pulled. It didn't move. Not stuck. Locked. From the outside. I could see the small electronic panel by the frame, its light dead along with everything else. And yet the bolt was engaged, solid, like it had been thrown on purpose the second the power dropped. That was when I stopped looking for reasonable explanations. I went to the window next, already knowing what I'd find. The glass was thick, double-paned, built for mountain storms, and it didn't budge either. I pressed my palm flat against it and felt the faint vibration of a motor somewhere inside the frame, winding down. Automated locks. The whole house was wired to seal itself shut, and someone had just given the command. I made myself breathe. I made myself think like the person who designs buildings for a living instead of the person trapped inside one. Every structure has a flaw, something the blueprint doesn't account for. I went for the closet, for that vent with the lens. Not to hide from it this time, to go past it. Behind the hanging rail, I found a seam in the wood paneling I'd missed before, a hairline gap just wide enough for fingers. I pulled, and the section of the closet wall swung inward like a door built to look like it wasn't one. Stairs, narrow, unfinished, leading down into black. I should have gone up, not down. But the stairs were the only part of that house that hadn't been sealed. At the bottom was a room lined with monitors, dozens of them, dark now with the power out, and beside them, shelves stacked floor to ceiling with hard drives, each one labeled with a date instead of a name. I didn't stop to look closer. I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, close, from a doorway at the far end of the room. I didn't run toward the sound. I ran toward the only other thing I recognized. A heavy grate above a cold hearth, a chimney flue wide enough, barely, for someone small enough and desperate enough. I grabbed the fire poker from the mantel on my way past, wedged it into the mechanism holding the flue shut, and started to climb. The climb up that flue felt endless. Soot in my throat, my knuckles scraped raw against brick, my whole body shaking from cold and adrenaline in equal measure. When I finally forced the cap off the top and pulled myself onto the roof, the mountain air hit me like something solid. I lay there in the snow, coughing, staring at a sky full of stars I couldn't appreciate at all. I didn't have a phone signal. I didn't have shoes. What I had was a ridgeline and the faint orange glow of another cabin's porch light half a mile down the slope. I don't remember most of that walk. I remember the cold stopped hurting after a while, which I now know is a bad sign, not a good one. I remember pounding on a stranger's door and saying words that didn't make sense even to me. The rescue team found me wrapped in blankets on that stranger's couch the next morning. My feet wrapped for frostbite, waiting for a helicopter. They found Grant 3 hours later, still in the basement, trying to wipe drives that were already backed up somewhere else. It turns out I wasn't his first guest to notice something was wrong. I was just the first one who made it out to say so. The hard drives held years of footage. Every guest, every room, every angle. And it hadn't just been for him. Detectives found the account logs, a private streaming site, paying subscribers watching in real time. The peace and quiet of that listing sold over and over to people who'd never set foot in Colorado. I think about the vent behind the closet more than I'd like to admit. How ordinary it looked. How I almost convinced myself it was nothing. I still stay in cabins sometimes. I still like the quiet. But now, before I unpack a single bag, I check every vent, every seam in the wall, every screw that looks a little too new. Because I learned something up on that mountain that I can't unlearn. Silence isn't the same thing as being alone. When I knocked on that cabin door to drop off a supply package, a young man opened it and smiled and thanked me. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the denture cup sitting on the table behind him, still in the water, still exactly where an 81-year-old man keeps his teeth every night before bed. My name's Casey. I'm 24. I drive last-mile delivery for a handful of remote outposts and ranger cabins scattered across rural Montana, places too far off the grid for regular carriers to bother with. Once a month, I make the long haul out to a narrow valley cabin to deliver medication to Walt, a retired forest ranger who's lived alone out there longer than I've been alive. The drive-in is nearly 2 hours of washed-out dirt road, deep forest pressing in on both sides, a river running loud and fast just past the tree line. No cell signal for most of it. I've done this route so many times, I could probably drive it with my eyes closed. Walt's always the one who answers the door. Always. Slow steps, a crooked grin, some comment about the weather before he signs for his package. Today, a man I'd never seen answered instead. Younger, maybe late 20s, polite in a way that felt just slightly too smooth. He said he was Walt's nephew, visiting for a few days, and that Walt was resting inside. I almost believed him completely. Almost handed him the package and driven off without a second thought. Then I saw the denture cup on the table behind him, and something in my chest went cold. I told myself there could be an explanation. Maybe Walt had a spare set. Maybe the nephew story was true, and I was reading too much into a cup of water on a table. I've delivered to enough strange, lonely places to know that not everything unusual means something's wrong. But my job has taught me to notice small things, and once I started noticing, I couldn't stop. The porch, usually cluttered with Walt's boots and his old fishing gear, had been swept clean. Walt never swept that porch in the 2 years I'd known him. The truck that was usually parked crooked by the woodpile, Walt's ancient dented Ford he refused to replace, was gone completely, like it had never been there. And the nephew didn't know where Walt kept the delivery log. Every single month, Walt signs the same clipboard, hanging on a nail by the door, same spot for as long as I've delivered here. When I asked for it, the man hesitated just a beat too long before saying it must be inside. And could I just step in and sign something else instead? I told myself it was reasonable. New person, unfamiliar house. Of course he wouldn't know where an old clipboard hangs. I was already halfway convinced I was overreacting, letting my imagination run because of one water cup that probably meant nothing. He held the door open for me, friendly, patient, gesturing toward a small desk just inside where I could apparently sign whatever paperwork he had waiting. I stepped inside. Behind me, so quiet I almost didn't register it, I heard the soft click of my truck door, the one I always leave unlocked out here. Keys still in the ignition out of habit, because nobody ever bothers a delivery truck 50 miles from anywhere. I turned my head just slightly, and I saw my keys already gone from where I'd left them. I didn't say anything about the keys. Every instinct I had told me to stay calm, to keep my face neutral, to not let him see that I'd noticed. My heart was slamming against my ribs, but I kept my voice level and asked again, casually, where Walt was. "Sleeping," the man said, still smiling. "He's not feeling well." I glanced past him, deeper into the cabin, and that's when I heard the front door click shut behind me, not slammed. Just quietly, deliberately locked. The deadbolt turning with a sound I felt more than heard. The cabin was dead silent, except for the river outside. That constant rushing noise that suddenly felt very far away, very unreachable. I looked at the man again, really looked this time, and noticed the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there a second ago. The friendly mask was still on his face, but something underneath it had shifted. He reached toward a shelf near the door, and when his hand came back, it was holding a heavy wrench. I didn't scream. I didn't lunge for the door. Every part of my training, every instinct built from 2 years of driving alone into places nobody would hear me from, told me the same thing. Don't give him a reason to move first. So I did the only thing that made sense. I nodded slow, like I understood, like I was going to cooperate. I let my hands drift down toward my belt, casual, unhurried, like I was just adjusting my jacket. My fingers found the canister I carry on every route out here. Bear spray, standard gear for anyone who works alone in this country. He was still talking. Some story about Walt needing rest. Still holding that wrench loose at his side. Still watching me like he had all the control in the room. I waited until he took one step closer. Then I brought the canister up and emptied it directly into his face. He screamed, stumbling backward, the wrench clattering to the floor as both hands flew to his eyes. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the kitchen, found the window over the sink, and threw myself through it. Glass and screen tearing at my arms as I hit the dirt outside and ran straight for the tree line. I ran until my legs gave out, deep into the trees, following the sound of the river, because it was the only thing I could orient myself by in the dark. I found a shallow rock overhang partway up a slope and pressed myself into it, staying still, staying quiet, listening for footsteps that never came. I stayed there all night. At first light, a search team found me. It turned out state police had already been combing the valley for an escaped fugitive who'd slipped custody 2 days earlier during a transport, and my missed check-in call had helped narrow down where to look. They found Walt inside the cabin. He'd been dead since the night before I arrived. The man I'd sprayed had taken my truck, desperate to get out of the valley. Before the perimeter closed, he didn't get far. Half blind and swerving on a road, I could have driven with my eyes shut. He lost control on one of the switchbacks and rolled the truck down a ravine. They found him alive, but barely, pinned against what was left of my dashboard. Walt had delivered mail and supplies to hikers and lookouts in that valley for 30 years before he retired. He never had any family that anyone could find. I was, as far as the investigators could tell, one of the only people who checked on him regularly. I still drive that same delivery route today, though someone else has taken over the valley cabins now. I still carry bear spray on my belt, same as always. But now, every single time someone opens a door I'm not expecting, I look past their face first. I check the room behind them before I ever believe a word they say. I hit the boat on a sandbar I didn't see coming, and after that, nothing about that night went the way it was supposed to. I remember sitting in that abandoned cabin, soaked through, cranking the handle on an old emergency radio I'd found wedged behind a shelf and thinking I'd finally caught a break. And then the radio crackled to life with my own voice. My own emergency call to 911, playing back to me word for word. Except this time, a different voice was answering it. I need to explain how I got there. I'd been out in the Everglades backcountry for 6 days, tracking wading bird nesting sites for a research grant, the kind of trip I'd done a dozen times before. Alone was normal for me. 4 hours from the nearest road was normal for me. I knew the channels, the tide patterns, the landmarks. What I didn't account for was the submerged limestone ridge that tore through my hull an hour before a storm rolled in. I limped the boat as far as it would go and found the cabin by accident. An old stilt structure half swallowed by mangroves, clearly abandoned since the 80s, but dry and standing. I told myself it was luck. Shelter, 4 walls, a roof holding against the rain. It wasn't until I found the hand crank radio in a drawer and got a channel to respond that something in me went quiet and wary, because the voice on the other end knew things about me it had no way of knowing yet. The voice introduced itself as dispatch, calm and clipped, the way every emergency operator I'd ever heard sounded. Copy your location, ma'am. Stay where you are. Help is 4 hours out by airboat, sooner if weather allows. Standard. Reasonable. I should have felt relieved. Instead, something small snagged in my chest when he asked me to confirm my exact position within the structure. Not the cabin's coordinates, my position inside it. I told him I was near the front window, and he said, "Copy that. Stay near the light source so rescue can spot you." There was no light source. I hadn't mentioned a flashlight. I was holding one off in my hand, because the cabin had no power and I hadn't wanted to waste the battery. I told myself I'd misspoken. Maybe I'd mentioned it and forgotten. 6 days alone does strange things to memory. 20 minutes later, he asked again, this time for what I was wearing, for identification purposes when the airboat arrives. I gave him a plain description, khaki jacket, gray pack, and he said, "Copy, khaki jacket. Try to keep the flashlight visible in the window. That'll help our approach in this rain." He said flashlight. Not light source this time. Flashlight, a word I never used. I stood very still in that cabin, radio in one hand, unlit flashlight in the other, and understood with a kind of cold clarity that whoever was on the other end of that channel wasn't describing what I'd told him. He was describing what he could see. I moved away from the window without a word, and the radio crackled again almost immediately. "Ma'am, we're losing your signal. Stay near the window so we can maintain contact." That's when I looked out through a gap in the boards, into the dark tree line past the yard, and thought, just for a second, that I saw a shape that hadn't been there a minute before, standing still, waiting for me to come back into view. I didn't answer him again. I set the radio down on the floor, still on, its faint static filling the room, and forced myself to think instead of panic. If he could see me, he was close. Close enough that 4 hours of rescue meant nothing, because whatever was coming for me wasn't coming from a station. It was already outside. I looked around the cabin with new eyes, not for comfort, but for exits. The stilt structure sat raised on wooden pilings above the swamp water, and through a gap in the floorboards near the back room, I could see black water moving slowly beneath the house. A crawl space. Low, cramped, but a way out of the room he was watching. First, though, I needed him looking somewhere else. I grabbed my spare jacket and pack from my bag, along with a length of rope from my gear, and built something crude in the dim light. A shape, stuffed and slouched, propped near the window where he'd been asking me to stand. From a distance, in bad light, in pouring rain, it would pass. It had to. I set my flashlight beside it, angled toward the glass, still off. Bait needs to look real, not lit up and obvious. Then I lowered myself through the gap in the floorboards, into the crawl space, into water, up to my knees, mangrove roots pressing against my back, and waited in the dark with my hand over my own radio to keep it silent. The felt endless. Rain hammering the roof above me, my own heartbeat louder than I wanted it to be. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, climbing the porch steps above my head. A pause at the door. And then it swung open, and a beam of light swept the room I'd just left. A voice, not the calm dispatcher voice anymore, but rough, low, talking to itself, said something I didn't catch. Then a gunshot, close enough that the sound seemed to shake the pilings around me, aimed at the shape in the window. In the half-second of silence after, I moved. Through the black water, toward the faint outline of a small boat I could see tied beneath the far end of the stilts. His boat, the one that had carried him here, without me ever hearing the engine. I didn't look back at the cabin. I got into that boat with hands shaking so badly, I fumbled the ignition twice, and on the third try, it caught. I heard him shout from somewhere above the waterline, close, closer than I wanted to think about, and then I was moving. Cutting through black water and rain, with no idea which direction led back to anything resembling safety. I ran that boat until the fuel gauge hit empty, and the storm finally broke into a gray, exhausted dawn. A fishing charter found me a few hours after that, hunched in the bottom of a stranger's boat, unable to explain at first why I was in it and not my own. It took investigators 3 days to find the cabin again, by air. They found the radio equipment, his equipment, not government issue, tuned to intercept exactly the frequency used by hikers and boaters' emergency radios in that stretch of the Everglades. He'd been doing it for years, they told me, poaching protected birds, protected gators, and using that same setup to track down anyone unlucky enough to get stranded close to his territory. I got the one thing most of them apparently hadn't: a head start. He's still out there, as far as I know, somewhere in that swamp, waiting for the next radio call that sounds like an accident. I still study wading birds. I still go out alone, because it's the work I love, and I refuse to let one night take that from me. But I carry 2 radios now, and I never say out loud into either one exactly where I'm standing.